Hello, my name is David Worthington. In this video I will demonstrate how to load test multiple tenants using Visual Studio Load Test in Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015. This video is the fifth video in the series of videos about load testing Microsoft Dynamics NAV. In this video we're going to create a load test to simulate 30 unique users distributed over 6 NAV tenants. The diagram here visualizes what a multi-tenant setup looks like. The difference, of course, being is that there's a separate database for each company and each user connects to the same NAV server. To follow the steps in this demonstration, you need some prerequisites. Visual Studio 2013 Ultimate, Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015 demo installation with the web client installed, and using NAV user password authentication. You need an NAV license that allows multiple concurrent users, and you should configure it, the test, for as many users as your license allows. And you should have followed all the steps in the previous videos about load testing Microsoft Dynamics NAV. These are the steps we're going to go through today. Firstly, I'll show you the setup of a multi-tenant NAV environment. We won't go through all the steps of creating a multi-tenant setup, but I'll demonstrate how I did it. Secondly, we'll configure our load test so that it distributes the load test users across multiple tenants. And then finally we'll run the load test and monitor the NAV server while it's running. So the first step is about setting up the multi-tenant environment. And I would strongly advise you to have a look at the Microsoft Dynamics NAV team blog about using PowerShell commandlets to modify companies and database, because this blog post covers all the steps you need to go from a single tenant demo database to a multi-tenant installation. I followed those steps and I've customized some of those PowerShell scripts, and I'll put them on the NAV load test repository. So here are the steps you go through. Firstly, you copy the demo company to create new companies, as many as you intend to test with. I gave them all the same name, Cronus 0 to 5. Then you export the NAV application to a separate database, and then you move the companies from the original database to a separate database for each tenant. And then finally you need to create the users for each of the tenants that you're going to be tested with. So let's just have a look in the virtual machine which I'm using, and in PowerShell we can see we have a script here just to show us what the setup is here. So if I run this script, I'll get firstly it shows the NAV application, which is in the demo NAV app database, and the 6 tenants I've created in their own databases, and the original default tenant, which is in the demo database. Finally, it shows the users that I've created. I've generated a bunch of users for our test here. I've also created a script here which is just after creating the tenants, we'll add test users to the tenant based on the same template we've used before. In this case, just doing it for all tenants. I won't run that now. So just to recap, this is our setup. I have 6 tenants, Cronus 0 to 5, each of them having a company, which just happens to have the same name, but as there's only one company, the connection will use the default company, and the users 0 to 5 in each tenant. So we'll be distributing the load across all these dimensions. So now we need to look at how we're going to distribute the load test users across the tenants. So the mapping I'm going to use is that for each Visual Studio virtual user, that will be distributed across a NAV tenant and then a NAV user in that tenant. So each Visual Studio has a unique ID. At runtime we can get that ID, and we'll use a simple mapping that converts that to a tenant ID and also a user ID. So let's have a look at the code for that. So firstly we're going to go into the order processor scenario file, and we'll modify the method to create the user context, and we'll use a new context manager called NAV user context manager. We'll configure the number of tenants, and we'll configure the number of users per tenant. In the order processor scenarios we have this method which we've seen before, which is the create user context manager, and for this demonstration we'll be using the NAV tenant user context manager if you look into that, the important thing is this method we use to create the user context. So firstly, it gets the user ID as we've done from the load test context before. Then it uses that user ID to find out which tenant the user should be pointing to. It does that simply by taking the number of tenants, which is 6, and doing a mod. So it means we'll get users distributed over the tenants in this way. And the second thing is we now choose which user within each tenant, and we do that by a similar method by doing a mod over the number of users per tenant in order to distribute them so we have multiple users on each tenant. So the next thing to do is to go back and prepare to run our test. So we're going to configure the load test pattern. I'm going to make a load test pattern that will ramp up to 30 users, so it'll result in an average of 5 users per tenant. And we're going to set up the performance monitors, and we'll monitor during the test run. So firstly, the load test pattern. So if we open our load test file here, I've simply set the pattern up here to maximum user count of 30. That's all I really need to do from the previous tests. And I've set the this particular test to run for 5 minutes only. If we go again to our server and we look in the performance monitor, I've set up a data collector set here, and this will collect the properties I need. So I'll start that data collector set now, so it'll be collecting performance counters throughout the test run. So if we now start the load test, and we'll wait for the results to begin coming in before we look at the server. So if we now look, we can stop our data collector set, we can look at the latest report, and here we can see the ramping up of users during our test. So if we select active sessions and highlight it, we can see that smoothly rises up. At the same time, we can see that despite the fact that we're using, as we can see, there are the mounted tenants, which is currently 7. And if we have a look at the amount of memory used in the NAV server, that steps up nicely as the tenants are being loaded. But if you compare to if you had a multi-instance setup, how much memory would be used for each instance, the amount of memory used for each active tenant is insignificant. And this is why we developed multi-tenancy. So the next thing is to look at our PowerShell scripts. We've got a script that will show us the active user sessions. So if we just have a rerun that now, we'll see the active users for each service, each session, and these are our test users. So as you can see, they're evenly distributed, user 0 to 4 across all the services and the 2 that I've connected to here. And of course you can also, if you look into the session list, you can see the users connected to this particular tenant, because you can only see one tenant at a time when you're connected through the role tenant client. So now that we can see our test run has completed successfully, and we've run, as we can see, quite a few tests in that 5 minutes. So there's been a fairly significant load on the machine, but the results are as expected for these tests. If we just look at the time, we can see that even though the tests are switching between tenants, there doesn't seem to be any particular overhead associated with that. Of course, at the beginning we can see the time it takes for the first test to actually connect to the server. So that's the completion of today's video. Just to go over the topics we covered: the setup of a multi-tenant NAV environment that was used in the test, how we configure the load test so that it distributes the load test users evenly across the tenants, and finally we ran the load test and monitored the NAV server. Here are some useful resources that will help you if you're trying to test with multi-tenancy. Firstly, the NAV load test repository on GitHub, where the source code and the PowerShell scripts are available. The blog post which I referred to earlier about using PowerShell commandlets to set up multiple companies and multiple databases. And finally, there's MSDN topics on monitoring NAV server using performance counters. So this video was created in collaboration with the Training Center Platan and Microsoft. Thanks for watching, and I hope you've learned something today.